He's not family. You can take him back to the waiting room. My son said it to a nurse half his age, in a voice pitched low enough that he probably thought I couldn't hear it, over the sound of the ER doors hissing shut behind him. I heard it anyway. 40 years of triage teaches an old medic to hear a whisper across a trauma bay better than most people hear a shout. I didn't argue with the nurse. I didn't raise my voice. The hallway smelled like rubbing alcohol and burnt coffee, and somewhere behind a curtain, a monitor was beeping in the slow, patient rhythm of a heart that wasn't in danger, which was more than I could say for the rhythm of my own. I reached into my jacket pocket instead, for the folded copy I always kept on me, out of habit more than suspicion, and I said, "Ma'am, before you send me anywhere, I need you to look at this." What my son didn't know, what he hadn't let himself remember, in the year since he'd gotten his life back, was that the papers in that folder, and the copy sitting in my truck's glove box for exactly a night like this one, still had my name on them, as the person legally allowed to say yes or no to what happened to his daughter next. 1 year earlier, nobody in my family would have believed it would come to this, that a father getting his life back together could feel to him like a threat, and that I would be the one standing in a hospital hallway having to prove I still had the right to love my granddaughter out loud. My name is Harold Dunbar. Folks have called me Hal since basic training, 49 years ago, and I've never once corrected them, because Harold always sounded like somebody else's father, not mine. I'm 68 years old. I spent 4 years as an Army combat medic, 2 tours, and then 31 more years as a civilian paramedic, and eventually a shift supervisor for the county EMS service in a small town called Cedar Hollow, Kentucky, the kind of town where the volunteer fire department still runs a fish fry every June. The diner still writes your order on an actual pad of paper, and everybody who's lived there longer than a decade can tell you which curve on Route 9 claims the most accidents in fog season. I married my wife, Loretta, the year I came home from my second tour. She ran the front desk at the elementary school for 26 years and knew the name of every child who ever walked through Cedar Hollow Elementary, including, eventually, our granddaughter, Maddie. Loretta died 5 years ago. A stroke, sudden, no long goodbye, just a Tuesday morning that turned into the worst day of my life before either of us had finished our coffee. I still make 2 cups some mornings, out of old habit, before I remember, and pour the second one down the sink. We had one son, Tommy, Thomas Harold Dunbar, 36 years old, a good kid growing up, quick with his hands, quicker with his temper, generous to a fault with people who didn't always deserve it. He worked construction most of his adult life, and 8 years ago, a scaffolding collapse crushed 2 vertebrae in his lower back and put him on painkillers that a doctor prescribed with good intentions and a pharmaceutical company backed with bad ones. I watched my son go from a man who could frame a house in a weekend to a man who couldn't remember driving home the night before. I watched it the way you watch a wound get infected when you know exactly what's happening and still can't stop it from spreading. Maddie was born in the middle of all that, Tommy's daughter, from a relationship with a young woman named Brianne, who left town before Maddie turned 2 and hasn't sent so much as a birthday card since. For a few years, Tommy held it together enough to be a functioning, loving, exhausted single father, and Loretta and I filled in every gap we could, the way grandparents do, telling ourselves it was temporary help and not a slow transfer of responsibility. 3 years ago, it stopped being temporary. Tommy relapsed hard the spring after Loretta died. Grief does that sometimes, to people already standing on thin ice. And one night in March, driving Maddie home from a birthday party, he fell asleep at a stop sign 2 blocks from his own house. A neighbor called it in. The responding officer was a woman named Denise Coulter, who I'd worked alongside for a decade, back when she was still in EMS before she crossed over to the sheriff's department, and she called me herself, at 11 at night, before she called anyone else, because she knew what it would mean for that 6-year-old girl if this went through the system instead of through family. "Hal," she said, "I need you to come get her right now, and I need you to be ready to go to family court, because if you're not, the state's going to place her in foster care by Friday." I was at that intersection in 11 minutes. Maddie was awake in her car seat, unhurt, confused, asking where her daddy was going in the back of a police car. I picked her up out of that seat myself, and I have relived that 11 minutes more times than I can count in the years since. The particular, specific fear of a grandfather standing on a dark road at midnight, doing triage on his own family instead of a stranger's, and finding the wound worse than he'd let himself believe. I filed for emergency guardianship the next morning. Ron Castellano, a family law attorney who'd handled Loretta's estate 3 years earlier, walked me through it in his office with a patience I didn't deserve, given how many times I made him repeat things because I wasn't hearing straight through the fear. The court granted it inside of 6 weeks, not custody in the adoptive sense, but legal guardianship, full authority over Maddie's medical care, her schooling, her day-to-day life, with Tommy retaining visitation rights contingent on supervised, documented sobriety. I remember standing in Judge Pruitt's courtroom that first time, in a suit I hadn't worn since Loretta's funeral, watching my son sit at the respondent's table in a jail-issued jumpsuit because he hadn't made bail yet on the DUI charge, and thinking that this was surely the lowest either of us would ever sink as a family. I was wrong about that. As it turned out, there were harder months still coming, months of Tommy relapsing once more, before the sobriety finally held for good. But I didn't know that yet, standing in that courtroom. I only knew that the 6-year-old girl sitting beside me, swinging her legs off a chair too tall for her, needed somebody in that room who wasn't scared of the paperwork. I want to be honest about something, because this story only makes sense if I am. I did not want that guardianship. I did not petition for it out of any hunger to be Maddie's father instead of her grandfather. I petitioned for it because the alternative was a stranger's living room and a case file with my granddaughter's name on it, and because Loretta, if she'd still been alive, would never have forgiven either of us, me or Tommy, for letting that happen when there was a grandfather 2 blocks away, with a spare bedroom, and a lifetime of knowing how to keep somebody alive. Tommy went to rehab that April, 90 days inpatient, then an intensive outpatient program, then 18 months of meetings I drove him to myself some weeks, sitting in the parking lot of a church basement in my truck with the radio on low, waiting to bring him home. There was one relapse in there too, 7 months in, a bad week I don't like to dwell on, where I drove 2 counties over at 2 in the morning to bring him back from a motel room before he did something that couldn't be undone. I never told Maddie about that week. Some chapters belong only to the adults who lived through them. I want you to understand that I was proud of him anyway. Proud of him through the relapse and past it. I am proud of him now. Nothing in what happened at that hospital erases how hard my son worked to become a man his daughter could be safe with again. But pride and legal authority are 2 different things, and somewhere in the last year, my son started confusing the 2. I talked about all of it, in pieces, over the following months, with the one person left in Cedar Hollow who'd known me longer than my own son had been alive, Ray Odom, my old EMS partner, retired now like me, who still met me every Wednesday morning at the Cedar Hollow Diner for eggs and a booth by the window, the same booth we'd sat in after hard calls for 20-some years, back when we needed somewhere quiet to put down what we'd just seen before we could go home to our families. "You're not her father, Hal," Ray said one Wednesday, stirring cream into coffee he didn't need cream in, just for something to do with his hands. "You keep acting like you have to choose between being her guardian and being her grandfather, like it's one or the other. It ain't. You can hold the clipboard and still just be the man who loves her. Those 2 things aren't in a tug-of-war unless you let them be." "Feels like a tug-of-war some nights," I admitted. "That's 'cause you're an old medic," Ray said. "You've spent your whole life being the man who takes charge in the worst 5 minutes of somebody's day. Habits hard to put down, even when the worst 5 minutes are over. And what the family actually needs from you now is just a grandfather. Not a rescue, just a grandfather." He pointed his fork at me. "Tommy doesn't need saving anymore, Hal. He needs you to believe he doesn't." I didn't have an answer for that one. Not that morning. I've thought about it plenty since. Tommy got clean, really clean, the kind of clean you can see in a man's eyes and the steadiness of his hands. About 14 months ago, he got a new job, foreman work, less physical strain on his back, better pay. And about 10 months ago, he met a woman named Kayla Renner, a hairdresser 2 towns over, with a 6-year-old son of her own, from a previous relationship, and within a handful of months, the 2 of them were talking about a future, a house, a wedding, a whole family under one roof. Tommy, and Kayla, and Maddie, and Kayla's boy, Eli. I liked Kayla, in the early going. She was kind to Maddie, patient in the particular way you have to be with a child who's been through more instability at 8 years old than most adults go through in a decade. She'd show up to Maddie's soccer games and cheer louder than anybody in the bleachers. I thought, my son found somebody good. What I didn't see, not clearly, not at first, was how much Kayla's vision of their future family depended on a story where Tommy's rock bottom was a closed chapter instead of an ongoing arrangement. A story where Tommy was simply Maddie's dad, full stop, the way any other father is his daughter's father, with no asterisk, no family court paperwork, no grandfather 2 blocks away holding legal authority, that Kayla, understandably, found confusing and, less understandably, started to find insulting. It came out first in small comments. "It's just weird," Kayla said to me once, at a cookout, not unkindly, that Tommy has to, ask you for permission to take her to the dentist. He's her dad. That's so backwards. I explained, patiently, that it wasn't permission so much as documentation, that guardianship required certain decisions to route through me on paper, for now, until the court reviewed the arrangement, and that none of it was about doubting Tommy day to day. It came out again a few months later, when Tommy started referring to our family in a way that quietly excluded me from the sentence. Not maliciously, I don't think, but the way a man edits his own story once he's ashamed of an earlier draft of it. "Once Kayla and I are married," he told me over the phone in the spring, "we want to petition to get the guardianship dissolved, full custody back to me, fresh start. No offense, Dad, but I think it'll be good for Maddie to just feel normal again. Not feel like she's got 2 dads." "None taken," I said, and meant it mostly. I wanted that too, for Tommy to stand fully on his own feet as Maddie's father, the way any father wants his son to carry his own weight once he's proven he can hold it. But wanting something and being ready for it are 2 different things, and I had already begun to notice, in ways I didn't say out loud, that Tommy's readiness had started to look a great deal like impatience. The clearest red flag came at Thanksgiving, 7 months before the hospital. Kayla hosted that year, her first time cooking a full holiday meal for a blended table, and I brought my mother's green bean casserole the way I always had, the way Loretta used to before me. Maddie sat between Eli and me, and at one point during the meal, Kayla's mother, visiting from Ohio and unfamiliar with our family's particular shape, asked, pleasantly, across the table, "So Hal, are you Tommy's father, or is this your daughter's side?" "Tommy's father," I said, "and Maddie's guardian, for now, while the courts sort out the paperwork." The table went quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when somebody said something true, that a few people at the table were hoping wouldn't come up over the mashed potatoes. Kayla's mother nodded, a little too brightly, and changed the subject to the weather. Kayla didn't look up from her plate. Tommy reached for the gravy boat like it required his full concentration. Later that night, washing dishes side by side, Kayla said, without looking at me, "You didn't have to say all that. The guardian part, in front of my mom." She asked a direct question, I said. I try not to lie to people, even about awkward things. It's just, every time it comes up, it's like a reminder to everybody in the room that we're not a normal family yet, she said. I want one Thanksgiving where nobody has to explain the paperwork. I understood what she meant, even then, even though I didn't fully agree with the wish underneath it. There is no such thing, in my experience, as a family with no paperwork at all. Every family has some quiet document holding it together. A will, a deed, a custody order, a promise nobody wrote down but everybody honors anyway. The paperwork isn't the wound, it's the bandage. But I didn't say that to Kayla that night, drying a casserole dish in her kitchen. I just said, I hear you, and let it be enough for one holiday. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in June, at Maddie's soccer practice. A scrimmage nothing more serious than that, when a collision on a routine header sent her to the ground, clutching the side of her head, not moving for 3 full seconds that felt, to everyone on that sideline, like 3 full minutes. The evening had been ordinary up until that point. The smell of cut grass, A portable speaker somebody's mother had brought playing pop songs too quiet to really hear, a line of lawn chairs and a cooler of orange slices. That's the thing about the worst moments of your life. They rarely bother to announce themselves ahead of time. I was there. I am always there, when I can be, because a paramedic's instincts don't retire even after the man does, and something in me needs to be close enough to help if help is ever needed. I was on the field before the coach finished blowing his whistle, checking her pupils, checking her grip strength, asking her to count my fingers. The whole practice sequence, my hands steady even though my heart wasn't. Maddie's eyes found mine somewhere in the middle of it, glassy and scared. And she said, in a small voice that didn't sound like her usual voice at all, "Papa, my head feels wrong." And I said, the way I've said to 1,000 frightened patients over 4 decades, "I know, sweetheart. I've got you. Just look right here at me." "She needs imaging," I told the coach. "Possible concussion, maybe worse. I'm calling it in." Tommy arrived at the field 4 minutes later. Kayla had called him the second it happened, sprinting across the grass in his work boots, still in his foreman's vest, and by the time he got there, the ambulance I'd flagged down myself, using 31 years of relationships with the exact crew who responded, was already loading Maddie in. I climbed in after her, out of pure instinct, the way I'd climbed into 100 ambulances in my working life. Except this time the patient on the gurney had my late wife's chin and my son's stubborn eyes, and Tommy climbed in behind me without a word. The two of us crammed into a space built for one family member, not two, both of us reaching for the same small hand. At the hospital, things moved fast, the way they do. Triage, imaging, a doctor with a clipboard asking questions Tommy answered half of and I answered half of. The two of us overlapping and correcting each other in the particular chaos of two people who love the same child and don't yet know how to share the room. Maddie was, thank God, going to be fine. A moderate concussion, no bleed, an overnight observation stay, out of an abundance of caution, the kind of outcome that leaves your knees weak with relief an hour after the fear has passed. It was during that observation stay, close to midnight, when Kayla arrived to relieve Tommy so he could go get Eli from her mother's house, that things went sideways. I'd stepped out to the hallway to call Ron Castellano, out of instinct, to make sure the medical consent paperwork on file matched what the hospital had. And when I came back toward Maddie's room, a new charge nurse, one who hadn't been on shift when I'd arrived, who didn't know me, who was simply doing her job by the book, stopped me at the door. "Sir, I'm sorry. Are you family?" she asked. And before I could answer, Tommy, standing just inside the doorway, tired and strung out from the fear of the night, in a way that made him reach for the wrong instinct instead of the right one, said the words that started all of this. "He's not family. You can take him back to the waiting room. I want to be fair to my son here, the way I was fair to a young woman I've told you about in another story from another family down the road. Fear makes people say things they don't mean in the shape they mean them. Tommy wasn't trying to erase me. I believe that, even now. I think, in that moment, exhausted and terrified, and standing next to a woman he was trying to build a normal family with, some old, ugly instinct in him reached for the simplest sentence that would keep this room feeling like his and Kayla's, and nobody else's. Not because he didn't love me, but because some small, unhealed part of him still associated my presence with the worst chapter of his life, the chapter where a police officer had to call his father instead of him. But the sentence still landed, and it landed on a nurse who had no reason to question it, and a hallway full of strangers, and an 8-year-old girl lying in a hospital bed 40 feet away, whose medical decisions, legally, still ran through me. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my jacket pocket, where I've kept a folded copy of the guardianship order since the week the court granted it. An old paramedic's habit, the same instinct that makes a man carry a spare set of car keys taped under the bumper for 30 years just in case, and I handed it to the nurse. "Ma'am," I said, "my name is Harold Dunbar. I'm this child's court-appointed legal guardian. That document names me as the individual authorized to make medical decisions on her behalf. I'd like to speak with the attending physician, and I'd like my son to hear this too, because I don't think he remembers signing off on this arrangement himself, 18 months ago, in Judge Pruitt's courtroom, when it was the only thing standing between his daughter and a foster placement. The hallway went very quiet. The nurse read the document twice, looked up at Tommy, looked back at me, and said, carefully, "I'm going to go get the charge physician. I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Dunbar." Tommy stood in that doorway like a man who'd just watched a wall he'd built collapse in front of him in real time. We didn't have the real conversation that night. A hospital hallway at midnight isn't the place for it, and I've learned, across 4 decades of delivering hard news to families in the worst moments of their lives, that timing matters as much as truth does. Maddie was discharged the next afternoon, groggy but grinning, already asking when she could go back to practice, the resilience of an 8-year-old already outpacing the fear of the adults around her. Tommy came to my house 3 days later, alone, without Kayla, and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Loretta used to grade her stack of school attendance sheets some evenings, the same table Maddie does her homework at twice a week, and for a long time, he didn't say anything at all. "I keep hearing myself say it," he finally said. "He's not family. I don't even know why I said it. You've been the only steady thing in her life for 3 years. In my life too, if I'm honest. And I stood in a hallway and told a nurse you weren't family. Like I could just erase it. Erase the whole chapter. Like if I said it out loud enough times it'd stop being true that I fell asleep at a stop sign with my daughter in the car, and you're the one who's been holding all of it together since. I think," I said, carefully, "that some part of you doesn't want it to have happened at all. And I understand that. I'd want to erase it too, if it were me. But Tommy, the guardianship isn't a punishment I'm holding over you. It's a bridge I built because the water was too high for you to cross that year. A bridge doesn't insult the man who eventually learns to swim on his own. It just means somebody didn't want him to drown while he was learning." "Then why does it feel like you don't trust me?" he said. And there it was, the real question underneath the sentence he'd said in that hallway, the one that had nothing to do with hospital paperwork and everything to do with a grown man's fear that his own father still saw him as the person from 3 years ago instead of the person sitting at this table now. "I trust the man in front of me completely," I said. "I've watched you rebuild yourself for 14 months, and I am prouder of you than I've been of almost anything in my life, including things I did myself. But trust and legal transition are 2 different clocks, son, and they don't run at the same speed. The court didn't ask me to trust you before they dissolved that order. They asked for a track record, documented, over time, the same way they asked it of you when you got sober. I can trust you with my whole heart, and still tell you the paperwork isn't caught up yet. Those aren't contradictions, they're just 2 different kinds of true." He put his head down on the table, the way he used to as a boy when a math problem beat him, and I let him sit there a while, the way I used to then too. After a long silence, he lifted his head and asked, quietly, "Did you ever think about just letting the state take her? That night at the stop sign, did you ever think it might have been easier?" It was a hard question, and I owed him a hard answer. For about 4 seconds, standing on that road, I said, I thought about how much simpler my life would be if I just let the system handle it. 4 seconds. Then I thought about your mother, and what she'd say to me if I let her granddaughter go into a stranger's house over 4 seconds of feeling sorry for myself, and the thought never came back. I've never regretted it, Tommy. Not for one night, not even the hard ones. But I won't pretend it wasn't hard. Raising an 8-year-old at 65 wasn't the retirement I had planned. I planned on fishing. I planned on being bored. Instead, I learned how to braid hair off a YouTube video at 11 o'clock at night before her school picture day. I'm not telling you that to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because I think you believe I did it easily, like it cost me nothing. And it didn't cost me nothing. It cost me plenty. I'd do it again tomorrow. But it cost me plenty. Tommy's eyes were wet by the time I finished, and he didn't wipe them, which told me more than anything he could have said. I won't pretend the weeks after that healed clean and fast. Kayla and I had our own hard conversation, about 2 weeks later, over coffee at the diner on Main, the same booth Ray and I usually claimed on Wednesdays, and she told me, with more honesty than I expected, that some part of her had wanted the guardianship gone, not out of malice but out of her own old wound. A childhood where a string of her mother's boyfriends had made her feel like an afterthought in her own house. And a fear, deep and half-buried, that any adult with authority over her future stepdaughter, who wasn't her or Tommy, was a threat to the real family she was trying to build for the first time in her life. "I wasn't trying to push you out," she said, turning her mug slowly on the table without drinking from it. "I think I was trying to make sure nobody could push me out. Different fear, same shape, maybe." "I understand that fear better than you'd think," I told her. "I buried my own wife 5 years ago and spent 2 years afraid that if I let anybody else matter to me, I'd be betraying her memory. Fear doesn't always aim itself at the right target, Kayla. I've made that mistake too. I said something to Tommy once," she admitted, quieter now, "that I'm not proud of. I told him it would be easier if you just weren't around as much. Not gone, just less present. I think that's part of why he said what he said in that hallway. I planted it, even if I didn't mean for it to come out that way, in front of a nurse. I sat with that for a moment. It would have been easy to let anger take the wheel, but I've learned, across a long career of delivering hard truths to frightened families, that the person telling you the truth deserves to be met with something other than punishment for telling it." "Thank you for saying that out loud," I said. "That took more courage than the version where you let me keep guessing. I'd rather know where a wound came from than just feel it and wonder." "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we build something slower and steadier than what either of us was scared into," I said. "You get to be Maddie's stepmother without me disappearing. I get to be her grandfather without holding a clipboard over your family forever. Tommy gets to be trusted, on a track record, the same way anybody earns trust, not because he demanded it, but because he showed up for it, month after month. Nobody has to lose for the rest of us to feel safe." Kayla reached across the table then and put her hand briefly over mine, the first time she'd done anything like that since I'd known her. "I'd like that," she said. "I think Eli would too. He asks about you more than you'd think, for a kid who's not even your grandson." "He's welcome to be, if he wants," I said. "I've got plenty of love left over. Loretta always said, I collected people the way other men collect fishing lures. Too many, no real system to it, but I never once regretted a single one." Taylor laughed, really laughed, for the first time since we'd sat down, and something in the booth loosened that hadn't been loose in months. We went to family court together, the 4 adults in Maddie's life, myself, Tommy, Kayla, and Ron Castellano representing the guardianship, 6 weeks after the hospital, not to dissolve anything overnight, but to formally establish a transition plan, 18 more months of documented stability, a graduated increase in Tommy's independent decision-making authority, regular check-ins, and, at the end of it, if everything held, a full transfer of guardianship back to Tommy, with my blessing and my name staying on record only as an emergency secondary contact, the way any grandfather's name should be. Judge Pruitt, reviewing the file, looked at Tommy for a long moment and said something I've thought about often since. "Mr. Dunbar, the fact that your father still had those papers in his truck a year after you got sober isn't an insult to how far you've come. It's the reason you got the chance to come this far at all. Some men don't get a father who's willing to hold the hard job long enough for them to heal. You did. I'd spend less energy resenting that bridge and more energy thanking the man who built it." Tommy didn't say anything in the courtroom, but he found me in the hallway afterward and hugged me the way he used to as a boy, hard and a little too long, and said, into my shoulder, "Thank you for not letting me drown." 9 months have passed since that hospital hallway. Maddie's concussion healed completely, and she's back on the soccer field, scoring goals with the same stubborn chin her grandmother had. Tommy and Kayla got married in October, a small ceremony in the backyard of the house they bought together. String lights strung between 2 oak trees Tommy had climbed as a boy in a different yard, on a different October, back when Loretta was still alive to fuss over his tie. I walked Maddie down a short strip of grass to stand beside her father, because somebody had to, and because Loretta would have wanted it to be me. Ray came to the wedding too, in a suit that hadn't fit him quite right since his own son's wedding a decade earlier, and he found me by the drink table afterward, watching Tommy spin Maddie in a slow, clumsy circle on the makeshift dance floor while Kayla laughed at both of them. "Told you," Ray said, nodding toward the yard. "You held the clipboard. Now you just get to be the grandfather. Look at you. You didn't even notice the switch happened. I noticed, I said. Took me longer than it should have. That's most men, Ray said, and clinked his plastic cup against mine, and we stood there a while, two old medics who'd spent their whole careers rushing toward the worst 5 minutes of other people's lives, finally allowed to just stand still and watch a good one unfold in front of them, uninterrupted. The guardianship transition is on schedule. 6 more months if everything holds, and it's holding. Tommy's kept every appointment, every check-in, every promise, and I've watched him grow, week by week, into the kind of father I always believed he could become, back before the accident and the pills and the worst year of both our lives. Eli calls me Papa Hal now, unprompted. Something Kayla told me happened on its own one afternoon at the kitchen table, and I keep a second fishing rod in my truck bed now, a smaller one, just his size, next to Maddie's. Last Sunday at dinner, Maddie asked Tommy a question that undid me a little, the good kind of undoing. Daddy, when the guardian thing is all done, does Papa stop being my guardian angel too? Tommy looked at me across the table, and something passed between us that didn't need words. The particular understanding of two men who've been on opposite sides of a hospital hallway and found their way back to the same side of a dinner table. No, baby, he said. Papa doesn't stop being anything. The paperwork just catches up to what's already true. If there's a lesson worth taking from all of this, it's this. Legal authority and love are not the same thing, but sometimes love is the only reason a person is willing to carry legal authority they never wanted in the first place. If you've ever been the family member who had to hold the hard job, the guardian, the emergency contact, the one who kept the paperwork in the truck just in case, know that the resentment you sometimes get for it isn't usually about you. It's about the wound underneath the person aiming it. And if you've ever been the one healing, ashamed of how far you fell, be patient with the people who caught you. They didn't build that bridge to keep you small. They built it so you'd have somewhere to stand while you learned to walk again. And if you're the one still holding the clipboard tonight, still carrying the folded papers in your glove box just in case, know that you're not required to hold it forever, and you're not required to hold it perfectly. You're only required to hold it long enough. If this story reminded you of your own family, a parent who quietly held more weight than anyone gave them credit for, or a moment you pushed away the very person who caught you when you fell, share this with them today, even if it feels overdue, and tell us in the comments about the person in your life who held the hard job so you didn't have to fall all the way down. Keep your papers close, and your people closer. I'm Harold Dunbar. Thanks for listening.